So our first speaker is Meir Gefen. We already mentioned him. He's a member of the Abriחה Legacy Association and the son of Abba Gefen, originally from Lithuania. And by the way, Meir Gefen, myself and Hannah Weiss, we are all from Lithuania. So, hooray Lithuania. And, well, Abba was the commander of the Abriחה in Bזלצבורג. And later on, he became a diplomat. He was also an ambassador, an Israeli ambassador. So everything is somehow connected. Israel is a small country, you know that. So Meir lectures is about the activity of the Abriחה in Bזלצבורג, which was a central junction of the passage of survivors from Eastern Europe to displaced camps in Germany and towards the ports in Italy. So, Meir, please. רק שנייה. מי שככה עד שמאיר יעלה את המצגת, אז מאיר הוא בנו של אבא גפן, שכל מי שככה קצת גדל עם סיפורי הבריחה, מודע לזה שהוא היה מפקד הבריחה בזלצבורג. ההרצאה של מאיר תהיה באנגלית, אבל הכיתובים במצגת יהיו בעברית, אז נוכל לעקוב גם בעברית, גם באנגלית, ואני בטוחה שיהיה לנו מאוד מאוד מעניין.
Hi, it's good to be here. כפי שגל אמרה, אני אדבר באנגלית, אבל לדוברי עברית, המצגת כולה בעברית. I will be speaking in English, but the slides are in Hebrew. So I will talk about the activities of the Abriחה in Bזלצבורג. And I'll start by showing this picture, which anyone who's been to Bזלצבורg I'm sure knows. This is one of the views of Bזלצבורg. By the way, this bridge is today called Marco Feingold Bridge. It's a very popular location in Bזלצבורg. But for us, in the Gefen family, and my brother is also here, for us, the picture that represents Bזלצבורg is different. This is the picture that represents Bזלצבורg, because this is where our family started. This is the picture of my parents' wedding, there in the middle, in 1947. And it took place in what was then the US Army's club, and something that happened to a lot of Abriחה people. My father was late for the wedding. And he was late for the wedding because he had to go to the border, because a group of about 100 people were stopped at the border, and they had to find a way to make some arrangement to the guards to let them pass. So he came late, but still came on time to be married. And 50 years later, אני אספר גם בעברית את הסיפור הזה, שהתמונה הזאת בשבילנו במשפחה, זאת התמונה שמייצגת את בזלצבורג. כי פה התחילה המשפחה שלנו. החתונה של ההורים שלי הייתה בבזלצבורג, אבא ואמא באמצע, המקום או המועדון של הצבא האמריקאי בלב בזלצבורג, ואבא, כמו הרבה אנשי בריחה אחרים, אבא אחר לחתונה. אבל למה הוא אחר? כי היה איזה טרנספורט של 100 איש שנתקע בגבול, ומישהו היה צריך ללכת ולשמן את השומרים ולארגן משהו בשביל שהטרנספורט יעבור. אז זו תמונה שאצלנו, בניגוד לתמונה הקודמת, שזה הנוף של בזלצבורג, זה הנוף של בזלצבורג שאנחנו גדלנו אותו. 50 years later, this is a picture. My parents went to Bזלצבורg, and this is the place. It's a restaurant, a famous restaurant called Sternbräu. And about 20 years later, we did the same thing. My wife and I and my son, we went to take a picture in the same place, so to keep the history of this location.
I took the picture, I can
Yeah, we went with Gal, we had a good lunch, and we took the picture. So my talk will be about the center of the Bricha. As you know, the Bricha had offices in many places. One of the places was Bzaltzburg. So I will talk a little bit about what was the situation in Austria in 1945 and later, how people got to Bzaltzburg, how Bricha had to work with all the different groups and organizations involved, how it evolved, and some stories of how they worked. So this is Austria in 1945, divided between the four occupying powers. So you have the US, you have the Soviet Union, you have Britain, and you have France. And there is a fifth occupying power, and this is not something the Bricha people invented. This is something that they heard from the British, from the Soviets, that they were considered by other groups as a fifth occupying power because they were everywhere, the Bricha. And I listed down how different countries, powers, were treating the Bricha. So the British obviously did everything they could to try to stop the operation of the Bricha, either by putting people in the borders, even borders that they were not involved with, or pressuring other governments. The Soviets did not really interfere. Sometimes they even helped. Some of the interest was to try to make trouble for the British in the Middle East by causing more people to go there. They knew that the British were against that. And actually they were found after the Soviet Union collapsed and the records were open, they found messages from Moscow to different embassies, Soviet embassies in Bulgaria and Romania, not to interfere with the work of the Bricha. The Americans were very helpful. They were the most helpful of the powers. They were a central factor in Austria. And the French actually usually helped. They were very oriented towards humanitarian help. So whenever there was a big problem, you could assume that the French would let people through. Now, how did people get to Bzaltzburg? And I'm showing here how my father made the route from Lithuania. During the war, he was for 3 years in the Holocaust. He was hiding in Lithuania. He was held after his family, most of his family was killed. He hid for 3 years with the farmers that helped him. And after the 3 years, he spent 1 year, since he knew who had collaborated in the area with the Germans, he joined the Soviet police and he got even, or managed to get even, with the people who killed his family and additional Jews. So he was working with the Soviet government against Nazi collaborators in Lithuania. And then he decided to go to Eretz Israel, to Israel, and he went to Krakow. In Krakow, he decided to join the Bricha. He heard that was what people were doing. And because he knew languages, they put him in charge of 10 other people. They told him, okay, now take them on. And they went to Katowice. In Katowice, they met the Bricha people that told them, okay, now you're Greek. You will learn Kalimera, Kalispera, you have to talk in Hebrew, and you get Greek IDs, and then you will cross the border as Greek. They went to Bratislava. There they made a larger group of Greek people, and they managed with 180 people to get to Vienna. In Vienna they had to continue, and the decision was to send them, this is the Soviet area, to the British area. So the Bricha managed to get them IDs that they were Austrian citizens that had been living or were living in the British area of Austria, and they needed to go back home. So they organized a group of 150 people with British IDs. They went to Severin because that was the place where the border to the British area was possible. When they got there, they realized that one day earlier, the British closed the borders. So they didn't know what to do, but the Bricha people that were organizing it said, no problem, go back to Vienna. In a couple of days, they got IDs that their original living place was in the US area of Austria. So they went on to Linz, then to Wales, and then they got stuck in Wales because the Americans were not letting people move from Wales to Salzburg. So again, Bricha said, no problem, you have these special papers that your concentration camp victims, that you have a lot of problems, and with those papers they managed to get to Salzburg and to a DP camp. So that took 2-3 weeks, but it showed, my father was so impressed by the work of the Bricha, by the way they operated, and he said, okay, I still have to wait my turn to come to go to Israel. I want to work here, I want to stay and help. And he stayed in Austria and started working in the organization in Salzburg. So what did people do what was the possibility in Salzburg? People in Salzburg had 3 choices. One was to stay in camps in the American area, but those were very small camps. The conditions were not good, and they had to stay for a short time. Families or people that were older, the best thing for them was to move to Germany. To move to Germany because there were the big camps, and there were education systems, and people would usually stay there for longer times. Or people could move to Italy. That was the difficult path, that was the risky path, and that usually the camps in Italy were very crowded, conditions were not good, but it was the best chance of reaching Eretz Israel, which was the main goal of the people. So Salzburg was a very central place because the headquarters of the US Army was in Salzburg, of the US Army controlling all of Austria. About 50% of the people who passed through Bricha ended up crossing Salzburg at some point, and it was a very tricky challenge because the Americans wanted to not grow the number, keep more or less the number of the people in the area constant, so they constantly had to struggle between getting as many people in, but also getting them out, or sometimes pretending that they got them out so that the numbers would be okay with the US Army. And they had a slogan. The slogan was always forward. So always forward means that when you cross a border, you have 2 points. You have a point where you leave one area and you point where you enter. Now, once you left an area, if the other side doesn't let you in, you don't go back. You find a way, you do something, you get people, you bribe, you pay, whatever, always forward to get to the land of Israel. This is, it's a bit heavy, but it took me time to understand how much politics and organization the Bricha people and the survivors had to undertake in order to work in many areas, but in Salzburg because of the concentration of so many countries. So there were all the armies, there were the US rabbis, there was the US Joint, the British Hebrew Brigade. From Israel there were many organizations that were active. There were the youth organizations, the political parties from Israel, from the land of Israel. Each one sent their emissary to try to get people to join their parties because they were going to be active in Israel. The Austrian police, the Austrian public opinion, they had to keep good public opinion. The Italians, the Germans, the UNRWA. It was part of these organizations, they were dealing with them legally, and part of it they were doing things illegally. So for example, the Joint could not do anything illegal, but occasionally the Bricha people would ask the Joint, give us a couple of trucks, give a couple of jeeps, don't ask what we do, we'll get them back to you. So it was all a very fine game to play in order to operate in all this ecosystem. Now in Salzburg, in 1945 initially there was a lot of activities of the brigade, the British brigade, the Israeli soldiers that were joined the British army, and the American rabbis, which were really the first ones who met the survivors. Here I want to mention Rabbi Eli Bonen. He's mentioned a lot in my father's writing. He was the rabbi of the division, the 42nd division that liberated Dachau. And he had a very good influence on the head of the division, General Collins. And he was a very special chaplain in the US Army because he was not only in charge of the Jewish soldiers, but they made him also the second highest chaplain in the area. So he was in charge of a lot of things. And at some point, the general told him, listen, if you need help for Jewish DPs, displaced people, don't go through all this army bureaucracy. Come directly to me. Tell me what you need and I will help. And at some point he managed to open a camp which was called New Palestine, and he managed to get some hotels in Bad Gastein to be dedicated fully to Jewish DPs. So there were a lot of politics between different organizations. At some point there was an agreement in Linz to manage how to control each point. And then I'm being pressured for time, so I'll make this short. The most active time was between May 46 and January 47. Sometimes they would have 1,000 people every day reaching Salzburg, and they had to find how to put them, where to move them, how to move to Germany. Especially after Kielce, after the pogrom of Kielce, there was a lot of activity. And then this person, who was the Captain Nowinski, who was in charge of all the refugees in the area, in the Salzburg area, he became very helpful to the Bricha. He writes later, after he retired, he said, I came to this place, and they told me those were a bunch of Italians and Greeks that had to go back home, and they had to cross to Italy. Now, he was originally from Polish origin, a Polish Catholic from American, and he says, but I heard everyone talking Polish. How can it be Italian? But he was very concerned about helping the people, and At some point later, he was interviewed and he was asked, "Did you do anything illegal?" He said, "No. These people said they were Italians. I just didn't look too closely at their birth certificates, that's all." In 1947, there was additional people that came from Romania. I will mention one more report. They established something called the Committee for Assistance to Jewish Refugees. At some point, the Americans could not give enough, they did not have the permission to give more permits. So Nowinski and my father decided to establish an organization. They had uniforms, they were called the CAJR, and they would give permits of the CAJR that looked very similar to American permits, and they managed to cross the border with these papers. At some point, the colleagues of Nowinski came to me and said, "Listen, what are they doing? I mean, these people are using documents to cross the border that the guards think are ours." So Nowinski's answer was, "If we don't do that, they will forge our papers. So better they use their papers than they use ours." This is a map of the camps inside Salzburg. Today, this is, you all know, this is the Mausoleum. There is one area of the Mausoleum that used to be a camp, Machane Herzl. These additional camps, Riedenberg, Mullen. This is outside Salzburg, Bad Gastein, where the hotels were, and Saalfelden, that was open later. A couple of small stories also related to the US Army. At some point there were arguments about the number of people, because 1,000 people would come into a camp and the UN would give food according to a number of people, and then let's say 1,000 people came out, but only 500 were reported out, so there was more food allocation. And some point people came to Nowinski and said, "What's going on? I mean, the numbers don't match." So he came to my father, and my father told him, "Listen, we have two types of people in the camps. We have people and we have angels. And we need food for both." So he laughed and he said, "Okay, let's make sure that the angels' percentage is no more than 25. And that's how there's many examples how they worked. I will not go into a lot of them, but the pass at the beginning was through the Brenner Pass, and there are people here that their parents crossed through Brenner. There were cases where when Italian prisoners of war were coming back officially, the Bricha would organize papers that people were Italian prisoners of war, and out of the train, the last two rails were Jews that were also kind of prisoners of war. At some point, the British became very wary of that, so they started crossing by foot, and then they found a path through Nauders, where there were only French, Austrian, and Italian guards. So they crossed there. When that became problematic, because the British were constantly looking how to stop the movement, then Krimmel became the main path. And they also opened sanatorium for people with tuberculosis. Yeah. And at some point when the guards were looking at the paper, the Bricha people would say, they all have papers, but watch out, they have tuberculosis, so don't. So they managed to move. They had a lot of, I would say, tricks. For example, they managed from Salzburg to Saalfelden, the shortest road was through Germany, because the road through Austria was very hilly. So they managed to get permission to take people from Salzburg inside Austria to Saalfelden through Germany, and they had 1 hour to cross that area. And there was an official way, entrance or exit, check the times, check the IDs, but they would take the older people from Salzburg to Bad Reichenau, quickly change it to young people who could go on the Krimmel, and then cross here and bring them to Saalfelden so they could go through Krimmel. Oh, Decca. Okay, so this is a picture that I found in my father's stuff, this picture of the visit of your father to Israel in 2007, and this is a picture of them, Dr. Loeschner showing my father probably what his plan was. I knew your father, I met with him several times, and I remember the excitement. One day he called me and said, Meir, it's not 5,000, it's 8,000. He was so excited. It was, yeah, it was. It's as if he has 3,000 more children. Okay, and just want to show one more thing. These are some pictures from Salzburg. This is we're looking for a path. This is again with Marco Feingold and his wife looking for a path. And this is one of the pictures I like best because it shows these were a bunch of young people that had lost everything. And they were dedicated to rebuilding the Jewish nation. And they also had some fun sometimes. They went and they were young people living with one goal in mind, to rebuild the Jewish nation. So, thank you.